Let us remember. At the last moment, Onan realized that he had been used by the genius of the species. He understood that he dedicated his life to something foreign. He left the world wishing he had been more aware of his circumstance. All of us. We are subject to the law of large numbers. This means that a small fraction survives in any population. Who is discarded? The vast majority. We are biological mechanisms, which follow certain directives and purposes, which, as we have already seen, try to maximize the first directive of the species, which is the directive of reproduction. The individual, as he advances in his own knowledge, notices that achieving the fullness of the self is not a simple task, since it involves understanding what is the programming that governs the very body that we use throughout our lives and in which, evidently, we are completely immersed. Am I just an epiphenomenon or a tool for the species to achieve its reproductive objective? A complex tool capable of handling information from the world in order to survive in it? Where are my purposes as a person? The vast majority of the human collective frequently presses the button of self-satisfaction or self-indulgence, the hedonistic button. In their search for physical pleasure, they use porn and even other techniques, which frequently include people as objects. But achieving the fulfillment of the body, the genius of the species, keeps us doped. Because the body gives us a great reward if we fulfill our reproductive work. And by doing so, the human collective feels happy and wants more of that serotonin. All that sexual activity, in these times, politically correct, promotes the production of steroids, epinephrine and norepinephrine, substances that control heart rate, blood pressure, among other functions. Sexual relations give rise to a wonderful cocktail of hormones, which involves catecholamines, cortisol, insulin, and glucagon. And this addiction distracts the collective for years. And following this directive of the species genius is mistaken for happiness. But in the end, the value of other people and the value of oneself are lost. What was left at the end of Onan's life? A tool, obediently carrying out the directives imposed in his programming, realizing the goals of the species genius. And like everyone in the human collective, in the end, Onan dies, content and distracted, ignorant of his own existence and unrealized potential. What will become of him after that? He did not build himself. He did not cultivate himself. But he did his duty by being an obedient tool. We know that we are a tool, like claws and fangs, an epiphenomenon that arose in the ontogenetic development of the ectoderm. Now that I know what constraints constrain me, I will be able to know myself. Mr. Onan knew, before he died, what the main constraint was. How long did Mr. Onan ignore that he was obeying a program? A program built to obey the directives to seek reproduction and have offspring. The Little Mouse in the Experiment by Peter Myler and James Olds, in 1953, showed how extreme this search for pleasure can be. The rats preferred to self-stimulate by pressing a button, rather than eating. As a result, they died. The human collective has a more sophisticated version of that button. But the reward remains the same. You just have to obey the directive and you get a wonderful prize, which consists of an incredible cocktail of drugs that produces a great release of hormones, neurotransmitters that influence mood, such as oxytocin, known as the love hormone, endorphins that produce analgesia and a great feeling of well-being during orgasm. In addition to many others, such as prolactin, serotonin, dopamine, etc. The collective is not aware, like Onan, that pressing the button of self-satisfaction is something imposed. It is not his business. It is a directive implanted in his brain, which he obeyed when he stopped being a child. Knowing himself and achieving transcendence is not something simple. There are still obstacles to overcome. The epiphenomenon of consciousness, originating in the ectoderm, realizes that it will not be able to know itself if it is not master of itself. A slave only knows the desires of his master. The individual must be able to prescribe himself. This implies eliminating the evolutionary and reproductive directives programmed in our biology, which harass him every second. How could I remove those programs? Let's remember that old RoboCop movie, when the hero erased the directives of his programming and was thus able to follow his own decisions and goals. It is also possible to overcome programming by understanding it, by being aware of it. Thus many psychological problems are remedied when they emerge to the surface of consciousness. Because, when the puppet is aware of the strings that manipulate him, the strings lose their power. But it is not easy to overcome the addictions that the genius of the species imposes on the collective. Psychologist Jordan Peterson said that it is very difficult to give up the addiction to pornography because it facilitates self-gratification. He maintains that pornography creates addiction by providing instant gratification without the effort necessary to achieve it in reality. This affects the brain's reward system with easy-to-acquire dopamine. There are terrible drugs, such as crack. Scholars know that it is not easy to quit, but many people succeed. But getting away from pornography is more difficult for the individual. It is important to know this, because it is very difficult to ignore the greatest reward that is given to the human collective. The collective is accustomed to the practice of active masturbation, with all its variants. It all comes down to getting the reward that the genius of the species gives us. This behavior, of pressing the hedonistic button, helps a lot to increase the population of the species, but it distracts the individual, moving him away from his own objectives and searches for transcendence. But Onan-style culture is proud to follow the path of hedonism. Flies and other little animals swarm, that is, they eat, evacuate, sleep, copulate intensely, and thus survive. The majority of the human collective does the same. It also swarms. Few individuals, within the human group, strive for excellence, quality in their being, to learn, to improve, in short, to transcend. But the vast majority is asleep, content in their cult of masturbation. How many will be saved? Very few. Will this distracted group of people transcend? Hardly. But there are some people who are not interested in pornography, nor do they even share Onan's frequent impulses to insistently push the self-indulgence button. The purpose of their lives is very different. There are people who have emotional relationships without having to resort to sexual relations. These people, known as ace people, asexual, natural celibate, can feel other types of attraction, such as romantic, intellectual, or emotional. Celibacy is a state of sexual abstinence, which is done through a vow. It resists the desire for self-satisfaction. It resists pushing the hedonic button. While the natural celibate does not have to strive to ignore sex or pornography, he simply is not interested, he does not pay attention to it. Let us conclude. If the human collective lives devoted to the biological needs of animals, it achieves the objectives of the species. But if it lives ignoring what it can become, then it will never be. That implies not being saved. Let us remember that those who are saved are very few. And curiously, natural celibates are extremely rare, and they have more opportunities to explore their own humanity, away from the distractions imposed by the genius of the species. Let us remember something very important. One becomes what one loves.